So, so here's the deal. Listen, everybody, it's Wellness Wednesday. It's time for another lunch and learn. I'm excited to have you all here with us today. I'm going to open up my gallery view, which is going to allow you to see our special guest that we have with us today, which is Jewel Woods. Jewel is the founder and clinical director at Male Behavioral Health. And we're excited because we're going to be talking about a very, very serious and important matter today. As you all know, Wellness Wednesday was actually designed in order for us as a part of our platform at ColumbusBlack.com to actually talk about the things that are impacting our community, the Black community, from a health and wellness perspective. Obviously, mental health is a critical part that, one, we don't talk enough about, two, we don't necessarily know how to address. However, it is very, very serious. So I'm excited to have our special guest with us because of the fact that this is his world. This is what he deals with every single day. And I'm looking forward to us being able to talk about some of the real issues addressing our community, as well as some of the recommendations and resources that may be available for us as we proceed. So with that being said, I would not do the right service, the level of service, if I try to do your introduction. So Jewel, I'm gonna turn it over to you if you want to introduce yourself to our audience, let them know who you are, and we'll go from there.
Appreciate you. Can't thank you enough, Mr. Lloyd. Can't thank Columbus Black for this sort of opportunity to talk about the sort of work and my sort of particular practice and the way in which we try to address mental health issues. So as you mentioned, my name is Jewel Woods. I'm the founder and clinical director of Male Behavioral Health. We have 3 locations, 1 location here in Gahanna, Ohio, 2 locations in Toledo, Ohio. We're currently partners with Columbus City Schools, also partnering with Toledo Public Schools. So we have been full-time operating for about a year now and offer a variety of outpatient services, including individual outpatient service as well as group services. Our whole practice philosophy is that we are dedicated to addressing the mental, emotional, and behavioral health needs of men and boys. We see mental health is, as you just mentioned, is a very important thing, but we also know that there's certain populations that don't access mental health services and don't think of mental health as a field the way in which others do. And men and boys happen to be that sort of group. So we're excited to provide what we think is a unique methodological sort of approach to joining with men and boys to address the myriad of issues that men and boys face. I make the comment oftentimes, Mr. Lloyd, that there's 2 types of both men and boys that I get in practice. The first group of men and boys are the ones who, by the time that they come, they're doing a lot worse than what they think they're doing. Why? Because the average man or boy, has no interest in going someplace and talk about their feelings or thoughts. So by the time that they do, things are just a little bit worse than what they think. The second group of men or boys that end up, coming to practice that I see quite often are the folks who just don't have any idea at all, honestly, of why they're there. Wow. They're typically being threatened by, their spouses or girlfriends or jobs because things have gotten so bad and they just end up there. In either case, I just sort of point this out to say that, men and boys come to private practice in different ways, but it's really, really important to pay attention to, the specific timing in which they come. Because oftentimes men and boys, as I mentioned, we're just doing a lot worse by the time we end up in outpatient therapy. And it's, absolutely my opportunity to intervene and to be a part of this sort of process.
Wow. So you just here's something that happens on these shows, man, that's always intriguing to me is, I tend to let people do their introduction and they share, what it is that they do or who they are. And you just go through it so naturally because it's what you do, right? Sure. But along that discussion and what you're sharing, you are dropping so many heavy things, right, in regards to what you're doing. And you talked about the education piece in that particular space. And you talk about men and boys, and you talk about like when they come to you and what they know or understand and don't. And it's so much in what you said in like 60, maybe 2 minutes. There's a lot in there. And what I want to do is I want to peel some of that back, right? As we have this time together and so make sure that people understand what that is and what you're doing. So with that being said, Jewel, if we take it back, right? And you think about mental wellness and you think about mental health. And I know for us as a community, we have some challenges on the physical side. And if nothing else, COVID-19 showed the disparities, right? Made it clear as day.
Right.
Now, one thing that everybody was able to see was that, you know what, guess what? There's a lot tied to that, right? When you look at the determinants, right, that are impacting our physical well-being and health, right? Now, the thing is that we have the same issue if you think about it mentally, though, right? If you think about the trauma, the historic trauma that our community is gone through, it resonates just as much as physical, if not more. So can you share like what you see and what you deal with as it relates to the historic component of our mental wealth? And as I look at that, I think that foundationally there's some challenges there, which is why we see what we see today. But do you have any perspective on that from what you do?
Sure. So there's two things that you said that are very, very exciting. So one, one would very much want to sort of create sort of space for us to talk about the sort of more acute things, the sort of community mental health issues, particularly for men in the sort of COVID-19 world, right? There's a particular sort of reality that I think many of the sort of men and boys that I see in private practice are dealing with that come precisely because of this unique time and place. And I'm more than happy to talk about that because issues about morbidity and mortality have been very, very prominent, you know, over the last year for a lot of folks. And so it's something that I like for us to be able to sort of talk about. But the other piece that you just mentioned is sort of foundational things, like how do we think about community mental health and the sort of challenge that African Americans, in particular, people of color in general, have had to deal with because of our sort of history. Now, there's a couple of different ways to think about that. And part of the way in which I would say is that reason why I think it's so necessary to have this sort of conversation, I can't appreciate you enough, is that the history of African-American intellectual life and political life always focuses, or there's a tendency to focus on the sociology of it, or the political economy of it, right? We know, for example, about slavery. We know what it actually meant, you know, to be brought here against our will. We know what Jim Crow is. We know what all those sort of things that end up being the sort of historiography of Black life. The mental health piece that you're sort of pointing attention to tries to pay attention to was, well, what are the sort of lived experiences of those folks who actually went through that? What did actually going through that actually create in the minds and hearts of people, right? Did it create a broken people or fragile people, or did it create people with resiliency, with coping skills that allowed them to be able to sort of, you know, get through these things with not just, you know, surviving, but with opportunities to thrive? And so that's from a mental health perspective and a community mental health perspective, really the type of sort of work that, you know, unfortunately, we just haven't paid attention to. Why? Part of it is just that we haven't had time to, right? You know, part of African-American life is that we had to keep it moving, you know, what young folks would say, right? Haven't had a lot of time. But in doing that, though, we perhaps missed opportunities to explore the type of sort of interior architecture that African Americans have built over time. So let me just say, so for example, so some people might talk about the historical trauma in a sort of general way. And trauma by definition literally just means the type of exposure to sort of adverse sort of experiences that creates certain wounds in people's lives where issues of anxiety or depression, perhaps even memory, right, become a certain problem for them. From a mental health perspective, we talk about those things not just as things that people have, but things that actually develop to the point where they affect people's lives in ways that they don't want to. So the historical trauma or the stress or anxiety of, having to worry about paying bills, having to worry about, for example, your freedom, right? Whether or not that actually lend itself to stress and depression to the point where a person wasn't able to function. From a mental health perspective, that's the way in which, we've, paid attention to it, just in terms of sort of intervention. But in general, right, if you're just talking about well-being, why wouldn't we pay attention to how Black folks have had to feel and what they thought going through what they've gone through with sort of crucible? And interestingly enough, the people that have paid the most attention to that, Brother Lloyd, has been our artists and intellectuals, not so much mental health professionals. It's been our writers, right, and our poets. We wear the mask, right? That grins and hides, and so it's been the Invisible Man, right? It's those wonderful works, right, which have explored the bluest eye. So unfortunately, we have this sort of sociology and political economy of Black life, and maybe some of our artists and intellectuals have really done the work of trying to create these sort of characters to sort of show our sort of meter experiences. But what we haven't had is this real sort of clinical history, right? This sort of psychiatric history to talk about how Black folks have dealt with anxiety, depression, serious things like psychosis, right? Trauma, grief, right? Some of that stuff has really just been thus far captured in some of our important works, but we really just don't have a lot of academic or intellectual products, to do that.
Right.
I'll give you an example. Black Rage, I think, was written in 1968 or 69, right? Okay. That's how long ago it's been, where a book tried to conceptualize what it means for African-American men to deal with, this sense of rage. I mean, so few and far in between, right? And that was by two psychiatrists, and, sort of debatable about, its sort of reach and depth. But I'm just saying the essence of your question, I'm just giving a sort of long view, speaks to the real opportunities to pay attention to the hearts and minds of African Americans, and not just the situations and circumstances that we found ourselves in, right? And while we know that's important to be true, because we always say that a person's biography shouldn't determine their destiny, from a mental health perspective, it really is important to actually figure out, what those issues are, so that we can actually do our best as professionals, right, to support them. And so that's important for a number of different sort of reasons that we can talk about. This whole idea about the strong Black woman and, brothers who have to be John Henry. There's just been so much effort and reality in Black life where we've had to keep it moving, suffer through, right? And it creates this sort of myth, right? This myth of superhero figures, and we've had to have Herculean sort of efforts to get through what we've gone through. But at the same time, it's just sometimes not given enough sort of attention to what it actually means to go through it. So that's one way of just for me sort of talking about it broadly, and we can get into more detail. But for example, anxiety. Why wouldn't Black folks have a historical perspective on anxiety, right? We think about anxiety as excessive worry and rumination, right? It's just one sort of, diagnostic sort of criterion. The idea that we've had to worry about our children, our freedom, right? The next day, right? Those are all historical things that literally are part of the African-American experience. Again, from a mental health perspective, the question becomes, how does that perspective about worrying and ruminating about one's family, one's circumstances, end up causing problems in people's lives? And I'm happy to share more. But the same thing applies to depression, right? Hope. Yeah. What has hope meant historically in African-American mental life? Right? In terms of, something sort of broad, but from a mental health perspective, we're talking about what does hope mean in terms of preserving and protecting a person's mood, right? Without hope, it's one of the greatest risk factors for depression and suicide. So we have to pay attention to those things from a mental health perspective, and that's historically why those sort of issues and themes are important.
So clearly, so first of all, thanks for going into that. So when you take a look at that you talked about the products, right? And the fact that there should be more on documentation, more focus, more emphasis. Are you starting to see any of that, especially with the level of awareness that we have now of some of the institutional components that have had an impact on the anxiety, the depression, all those things that are actually impacting us, not just mentally, but also now impacting us physically, tied together. So are you starting to see any focus or emphasis on any of that yet?
Some, certainly not enough. And again, depending upon where areas we're talking about. And again, my particular sort of interest is around African-American men and boys. What I would share, for example, and our audience may or may not be aware that the APA, the American Psychological Association, didn't come out with their professional standards of working with men and boys until 2018, which was just 3 years ago.
2018.
And again, those were just practice guidelines, and they have sort of, things. So literally within the last 3 years, there's just been a focus to talk about, specific therapeutic sort of approaches and modalities for working with men and boys. So for that group as men and boys, it's been a long time coming, right? Now we can compare that to other sort of fields like, new masculinity and sociology. That sort of field came out in the 1980s. And so they have about 30 more years of actually dealing with, again, the sort of sociological aspects of men and boys' lives. But again, the psychology, the emotionality, really sort of treating men as subjects, which is the thing that I am most focused on in my private practice. That's a new sort of field. Again, the challenges for communities of color, and again, particularly for African-American men, is just something that we, given all the struggles and all the issues that we've had to deal with, hasn't gotten enough attention. And so we're moving closer to that. And I don't want to give the impression that there's nothing done, but certainly not at the scale, and certainly not at with the type of breadth and depth that it needs to. And here's what I mean. And just, speaking about it in terms of, like systems, right? As a social worker, you're always trying to think about micro, macro, and meso, that sort of individual level. Reality is that just, on the micro level, you just got, we don't have enough African-American, certainly not enough African-American men therapists. We just don't, right? The field as it's sort of organized is typically, more white and more female. Again, none of those are sort of exclusionary criteria for focusing on men and boys, but, and I'll talk more about that, but the reality is that the field just doesn't lend itself, and has not for the last, 40, 50 years, to having more male therapists just to be able to do some of the sort of work, right? On the meso by organizational institutional level, we just don't have a lot of institutions that, provide these sort of services, provide these services with this particular sort of area of focus or expertise. We don't have enough African-American social service agencies in general, let alone those in particular that offer this type of focus. And then on the macro level, what we just said is, so much of our reality, and we can, the current issues of police violence and, all the things that we, are confronted with, just doesn't lend itself easily and often to talking about men's emotions and men's behaviors. And I'll say the other piece, the reason why that's the case is because by doing that, there's an implicit admission of sort of, weakness and fragility, right? That as a people, for example, not so easy to do, right?
Right.
So much of, the confidence that we get, again, going back to our history, is of overcoming, is of the ability to be resilient. When we start to have these sort of conversations about, some of our leaders and their issues with anxiety or depression, right? Spaces in male culture don't really allow for that, right? You don't have the opportunity to talk about dealing with depression as a leader or in sports, all these other sort of areas that, so again, while there's opportunities, we just haven't, we see more efforts in these areas, the micro and the meso and the macro level, just not at the scale that we would hope, and, that we're moving forward, certainly at male behavioral health to address.
Yeah. So Jill, I listened to you and it's just like, man, it's just so deep, right? And, we're dealing with real life issues and matters. And I'm hearing one side of this, we're resilient because we have overcome, right? So much, right? Overcoming so much adversity and challenge and change. And then at the same time, some are so broken from that, right? No, everybody hasn't just overcome, right? Like people are broken and it's real. And, for me, just to ask you, right, like how do we as and then before I even go to how do we even start to take that first step, you brought up something that's important when you talk about the clinicians, right, and the experts in this area, especially from a Black perspective. And I've known throughout my time growing up, we've had a lot of people focused on social work, right? We had social work majors, and you would think that, especially from a Black community standpoint, a lot of us would be in this field as experts and being able to help. But it sounds like we still have some gaps there. And it reminds me of education, right? Like having a Black teacher, right, has a totally different impact on a Black student than not, right? And the same thing in corporate America, right? When you have that vice president or president or CEO that's Black, and you can resonate and relate to that individual, it makes a difference. I would expect it's the same thing with the clinician and that expert that you're going to for expert advice and that relativity to understand what it is that we're going through. So I'm listening to and I'm absorbing everything. It's just so much, right? There's so many layers to it. But with that being said, Something that I want to see if we could talk about that's very relevant to our community right now. And as you focus on Black men and our youth,
Yeah.
right now, especially in Columbus, we have a situation where, you know, there's an alarming number of homicides and shootings and killings, and our youth are, you know, challenged with that. You
Yes.
know, as adults, we have situations where we have unarmed Black men being, you know, killed. And so starting with our youth, because everybody's asking that question, based off of your expertise, is there a recommendation, thought, like, or like you say, here's the root cause as to what we're dealing with because of how much you see that your average person doesn't get, that's impacting our youth, that's keeping this particular cycle that we all want to end, that continues to happen. So I want to broach that subject and just get your perspective as a professional.
No. I appreciate the question. I appreciate, you know, the spirit in which it comes from. So there's, again, and those are really important topics. And again, I'll apologize in advance because I'll say is, you know, on one level, the social determinants of, you know, youth violence, African-American, urban violence, all this sort of stuff, very well known. Folks can talk about that, I think, at length. My sort of what I would do if you know, online is to really just talk about the sort of clinical implications about things that are sort of involved in it. And so from a mental health perspective, for example, we say that the three sort of, how should I say it? Three sort of pillars, of real sort of psychiatric sort of issues, particularly when we're thinking about sort of lethality, we're talking about, you know, psychosis, suicide, and homicide. Of those three, homicide is literally like the last thing that folks talk about, and it's really the one most under sort of researched areas when one thinks about sort of mental health. So in other words, when we, you know, if somebody would ask, you know, what are the risk factors, you know, that we should pay attention to when it comes to a psychotic person, we can be able to sort of name those, you know, delusional, paranoid, all those sorts of things. Same thing when it comes to suicidality, a number of different sort of risk stratification things, you know, hopelessness, past. So, but for homicide, right? What is it, the sort of risk factors, the sort of aspects to sort of pay attention to when you think about a person's proclivity or inclinations towards killing another person? There's just a lot there. And again, part of that has to do, unfortunately, with this population. Again, we know, for example, the structure of violence, particularly gun violence, is, you know, males, right? Again, there's just been a little interest academically and intellectually to explore what that actually looks like. So for example, to think, and I'm saying here's the real tragedy behind that, to think that our young males who are involved in this type of dynamic, gunplay leading to, you know, murder, don't feel a certain way about either doing what they're doing or being the victims of what they're doing, is to almost sort of create an idea of our youth as being sociopaths, as if they don't have any sort of feeling, right? So we don't pay attention to, we don't know where a young person is at when they're thinking in their mind, when they're actually even getting to the point of using, you know, a weapon to take another person's life. So that type of betrayal of young people, that type of lack of interest in their lives, you know, on a personal level, makes me want to apologize. Because if we're not checking in with young folks to actually see what gets you to a point where taking another person's life, right, is a choice that you make, to not be interested in that and only have on that opposite side, right, jail, juvenile detention, but no real sort of mental health. It's to almost sort of demonize our young folks. So on a clinical perspective, I just start off with that there's just a lack of interest and a lack of, I didn't even say love, for young folks to be able to figure out, you know, what it means to actually get to that point where homicidality is thought of at the same levels of these other sort of risk factors. So that's the first, right? The second thing is, what we fail here in this city, but I also say in general, is the sort of back end. We don't necessarily have a sort of psychiatric or crisis response system that allows for us to effectively intervene when these situations occur, particularly given the things that we just said, right? So, you know, some systems that, you know, sort of, there's a trauma system that comes out, not a lot of Black folks, not a lot of trained Black clinicians who can join with families, right? Who can help them and other folks deal with the sort of collateral damage, you know, understand what, right? deal with this sort of tension of Black on Black violence and try to understand it in some ways that, are not sort of caught up in, just sort of tropes. So on the front end, we don't have a lot of sort of interested in being able to sort of pay attention to the sort of risk factors. And even on the back end, when this stuff actually happens to our community, we don't have systems for individuals to properly sort of follow up with that. And here's the way, here's another specific way in which I'll, again, I appreciate your patience and just talking about why that matters. The Black Lives Matter movement was literally based upon this aspect of grieving called disenfranchised grief. Now, what is that? So, grief is not the same thing as mourning. Mourning is not the same thing as a sort of bereavement and all those sorts of things. But just to talk about grief, the feeling of dealing with a sense of loss. Disenfranchised grief is when you have that sort of burden of loss, but your loss is just not validated by other folks. Here's a way of giving that as an example. Let's say, unfortunately, you lost a family member, but because of, you got to work, you got to go to the job, and the job is, not interested in your loss. They're interested in you being a worker. Disenfranchised grief is the idea that, people can experience loss, but it's just not represented in reality. So what does that mean for Black folks? So for Black Lives Matters, we're saying, look, Black people are dying. And yet the society is not paying attention to it, right? Society is not paying attention to, and so disenfranchised grief, I'm just saying, is another specific community mental health aspect of trying to pay attention to what are the effects on communities. And we can talk about Black men when you have all these young folks who experience loss. I work with 2 young men today, and part of the thing that I deal with certain groups of young males is I use hip hop as a means by which to sort of talk about mental health. And so today we literally, I use Kendrick Lamar's Feel, and what else did I did? I think I even, they didn't like this at all, but I did Logic's Take It Back. And they threw up some Young Blood and a couple other songs. Why? Because it spoke to their experiences of loss. It spoke to the experiences of their connection with their boys and all this sort of stuff. And I'm saying, and that was just a sort of, one way for me to join with them, right? So, because, they're not giving it up, easily and often, right?
That's right.
You have to find ways, different sort of techniques and things to be able to sort of get at that. But my only point is that by simply going there with them is to acknowledge their loss, to say that I can disagree with all the sort of things that get to it, but you got to start there. And so this disenfranchised grief, this sort of inability for systems or professionals to pay attention to Black death is what is the basis of the Black Lives Movement in general.
Heavy, and so real. I think about, especially in light of what we have going on, right, with the trial right now with George Floyd in his murder last year, but it was all those murders prior to that. And you talked about disenfranchised grief. I mean, that's exactly what it's been. It's been like, these lives are being taken. There's no respect for the fact that the families, that's the part that always hits me, is the families and the friends of those individuals. It's just like, it's just no big deal, right? Like their entire lives have been impacted, but it doesn't matter, right? Totally unacceptable.
Just community dealing with loss, families dealing with lost brothers. And again, not just physical loss, lost incarceration systems and all, just loss that communities are dealing with. Churches, families, educational institutions, just a loss of talent, loss of people's bringing their own sort of individualities and their stories. There's just and again, we can talk more specifically about the relationship aspects of this. A loss of a father, right? A loss of a spouse, right? Black women having to do a lot of this stuff on their own, right? So, and again, the disenfranchised grief, and I apologize for interrupting, and because we were talked about, going back to this reality of now, what's so acute now, and COVID and unrest. It's just, the George Floyd murder, and language is really important. To another sort of aspect of the African-American experience where this whole idea of disenfranchised grief, and particularly for Black men, is so important. Because one of the things, and I think that the testimonies yesterday by some of the folks, and I would encourage everybody to as difficult as it is, but to listen to some testimonies. Why? Because here's what's important. Imagine yourself being, and not even have to imagine, because we're there, right? And this is what the technology is often, where we're watching the murder of George Floyd. Imagine what you're thinking, imagine what you're feeling during that time. But then you combine those with the question, what are you doing? So what happens is, and this is what was reflected in testimony, is all of those people, the bystanders, were absolutely powerless to intervene. Yep. And that type of shame, the one person talked about apologizing, just felt like, I apologized because I didn't do enough. The guilt turns into, and this is a difference between rage and outrage. The outrage expressed by the Black Lives Movement is an indication of the rage of those feelings, shame, guilt, powerlessness, but a sense of right and a sense of justice, injustice. That's the difference between rage and outrage. One is just the sort of feeling that has this, profound sort of subjective reality. The other one is that subjective reality balanced by senses of right and wrong, right? And so it's not as if we're just caught up in our feelings with this. We know that this stuff is wrong.
Yep.
Nobody should be.
That's right.
That's where, for example, when Black men or Black people have this sort of feeling about, police, and when it's not irrational. This goes back to it's an acknowledgement that there's just very few aspects of American life that has this type of power over us where we can't be resilient. We can't overcome, because the police can kill us and take away our freedom. The two things that are part of our history here in this country, the ability to take away our lives and the ability to take away our freedom. That's what the police represent. And again, we can talk about that, but that's the reality. And that's what we feel, right? On a sort of deep psychiatric and psychological level when it comes to police violence, and all those sort of issues related to it.
All right. So for my regular viewers, I'm sure some of them have been waiting for me to do something. Anytime you drop knowledge on this show, we have what we call gem drops. And I do this anytime you drop a gem. And what they'll notice is that I have not been doing that. Not because you haven't been dropping gems, it's because it's such a powerful conversation. I'm almost in the shock and awe type. It's so heavy. But I can't help but to drop those gems now, because you are just bringing it to us in a way that I think we need to hear it, right? Like the depth of what we're dealing with. And you talk about this policing piece, right? And the way you just eloquently broke that down is a way that's really like our freedom and our lives. Yeah, definitely. If those two things are presented to you as being on the line, you're going to act a little bit different. It's gonna impact you. And when everything you have seen, your entire life has shown you that, how could you not deal with anxiety? How could you not deal with the depression of that weight of not being able to necessarily be resilient, as you said, at certain times? Because it's no different than right now. What we say, what do we teach our kids, especially our Black males, when you're driving, what to do, right? In order to make it home alive. Right now, the goal of this talk wasn't to go down this lane that deep on that particular issue, but that's real. That's so serious, and it's in the forefront of everything we're dealing with. So I appreciate you bringing it down to that, because that's serious. Like, we've been a resilient people, but those are two key things that we have to worry about at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, again, going back to this story, right, that we're trying to balance between resilience and overcoming and these sort of wounds, this is where we have to sort of then look at some of the statistics which show that we, aren't doing so well. Right. Right. When we look at the Black family, the absentee, all those sort of issues. But for men, for example, the ways in which we've coped with these things are sort of indications we have resilience. We have twice the rate of addiction when it comes to substance use abuse, right? We have 3 or 4 times the rate of suicide, right? Violence, anger ends up being one of the responses to these things. One of the things that, when I was a young clinician, back in the day, right, I used to always say that just three emotions that we sort of attribute to men: happy, hungry, and horny. That was it. Right? That's all we would think that brothers would be. But of course, there's a lot more to it. But to your point, those just end up being examples of where and indications where we just are not doing so well, and why it really is important to pay attention to the mental health aspects. The statistics, unfortunately, bear out the facts. When we look at the high suicide rates, when we look at the high substance abuse rates, when we look at, we can talk about relationships, we're not doing so well. And mental health professionals, those, and again, I want to, go back to something you said, because it's very, very important. Because my challenge to my field is to say, on one level, any, clinician that's good should be able to deal with these issues. Right, it does matter. It does matter, for example, what the, race, ethnicity, and sexuality of a clinician is. We just know that through research, right? There was a whole body of multicultural, research for therapy, which shows that literally after the first meeting, like 50% of clients just wouldn't show up because they just didn't feel that sort of connection. But beyond that, right, good therapists, all have to figure out how to sort of align and join themselves, this whole therapeutic rapport. The question becomes, going back to, the stuff that we've been talking about, is whether or not, the field and these therapists have any sort of competencies when working with men and boys. Do they know do they know the history, right? Do they know the sort of issues and things about masculinities? And I won't say just one. Heck, can they talk about sports in a way that's just, not conversation, right? But actually gets at some sort of emotionality, right? So there's, and again, as I alluded to, there just hasn't been enough attention and effort to address it. And so it puts a lot of responsibility on clinicians and professionals to try to get that information on their own. So no, I love what you're sharing. I really appreciate it. But the bottom line is, when we do look at the sort of data, a lot of us are not doing well. And it's precisely why male behavioral health exists.
Exactly. So, and we appreciate what you're doing. I'm happy we have you, right? And yes, we may need more, but I'm happy that we have you as a resource. Okay, brother. So thank you for what you're doing. So with that being said, right, it starts with one, right? It takes one, and then you grow from there. And I know you've been also expanding your reach, right? Can you share a little bit more about that? And then I want to talk about, what I want to do is talk about, how do we as a community help push the envelope, right? For there to be more studies in focus. Because if we don't get to the root cause, it never changes, right? If you don't get to the foundation and fix the foundation, guess what? We're going to have the same thing. And that's the reason why we keep saying 30, 40, 50 years, why we're still dealing with the same thing. It's never been addressed, like you said.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So in terms of what our sort of model is, model is really simple. We're trying to, at Male Behavioral Health, be as much a part of the culture and community as possible. And so, as I mentioned, we have 2 offices now in Toledo, and that's recent. And the goal is to position ourselves in, major sort of cities, in places and spaces where they have first and foremost access to schools of social work, so that, to your point, these professionals have the opportunity to learn the sort of skills and things that at this particular point still just actually not a part of even like schools of social work curriculum. Trust me, part of that sort of discussion. So we built, for example, just opened 2 offices in Toledo. We have one that's a campus location that's literally set up for just students, faculty, and staff. And then we have a regular office location just for our sort of general population. And we hope to be able to sort of expand that. And my goal, again, as much as I get, a great deal of pleasure being part of the process. And we've been talking broadly. I love to talk about what it's like to actually do the work, but I also spend a lot of time, supervising and trying to, be of support to younger clinicians, right? That's the other sort of burden / opportunity that folks have, is to pay it forward, right? And if I do my job well, right, I can just, sit back and part of my legacy, right, is to say that I was.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's what we're trying to do. And again, the particular sort of methodological sort of approach we work with men and boys, I think, is something unique. But it really is creating space, right? Make sure that ends up being a part of curriculum, part of sort of institutions, do a lot of sort of training and workshops to try to, build this, what we call community of practice. To go back to this larger question though, about, sort of getting at the source, it's a wonderful question. And I can tell you how I sort of address that with some clients. Because I get some men who come in, right, and again, because they're not doing well, they want to know why. Well, why am I, having panic attacks? Why can I get this out of my mind? And part of my response to them, because whys are important. And it is important to get at that foundationally, but it's also important to make them feel better. And I just tell a man, I say, what, we can get at the sort of whys, and if, for example, if I can't do it, then I'll find a sort of treatment modality that, might be better than what I do, because I'm more sort of talk therapy. But also the opportunity is to make sure that you're feeling better during this time, right? So that you're not feeling. And so I say that only to say that while we work on the whys, it is really important to make sure that we're referring people in trouble, all right? And that the message to ColumbusBlack and all, folks that might be a part of this audience now is that, if you think that you have men and boys in your lives, guys that, might not be doing well, might not be their better selves, please have them come see me, because it's important to, while we figure out the whys, to have them be with some people who can help them cope a little bit better, right? To feel a little bit better so that they a little bit more patient, right? Don't pop off a little bit more. Things that just don't allow us to be ourselves. And I just came back from West Africa. I was in Ghana, where my family's from. And, always sort of learn things when when I come back. And of course, you can't be but grateful. And when you see people being resilient. Right? And one of the things that, conversations that I am having, and I've given talks at, college and universities there in the past, but, this whole idea that, mental health problems that you guys have in the West, are just, as Africans, we don't necessarily have that. Again, going almost back to this thing. And what I want to say, it is true that on one level, it is a sign of progress to be able to have resources to deal with issues, right? And so my response to them was, just like it's progress to have an infrastructure with sewage systems and things like that, right? Because otherwise you're just going in the bush somewhere. So so on one level, there's this temptation to kind of minimize, the idea of having a therapist, the idea of having somebody to help us work out and lose weight. Those are all gifts and opportunities that we should take advantage of, right? And I do think, and this is another way of talking about the unique challenges of young folks, because again, as old folks, we always, I think there's a temptation in African-American life and being older in general, we say to young folks, well, when I was your age, I had to, walk 15 miles and, do all that sort of stuff. Again, that sort of story of overcoming and achieving, things are different, right? Things are different now. And the types of stressors, the lack of support that so many young folks feel. We just, again, I said, I was talking to the young folks today, and we used Feeling by Kendrick Lamar, and this, his sort of chorus is "Ain't nobody praying for me," right? Right. And we talked about how, because the song is called, Feeling, he's literally just talking about his feelings. And my sort of, again, I won't proclaim to be some sort of musicologist, but the reason why that worked for me is when you get to this point where you really are sort of caught up in your feelings and they're coming at you like fast, like during the song, because he's just, right? It's coming from the space where at that moment in time, you feel like that nobody's there for you. You do feel alone, right? You feel hopeless, right? That's why everything is feeling dark, because there's just no hope. Ain't nobody praying for me, right? And so creating, there you go, the boom.
Dropping them jams. Go ahead, bro.
I'm just saying, brother. So this whole idea of, again, focusing on the whys, but really just making sure that we got people there to support and protect folks, young folks and old folks, when they're struggling is important. I have a good group, I'll say this last thing, of men in their 60s, Brother Lloyd. Men that's been married for 20, 30 years, right? But because of COVID, right? This time where, questions of health, morbidity, getting sick, forced them to start thinking about legacy, just a couple years sooner than they were ready to, right?
Yeah.
Started to get them sort of worried about, what is this? And then start to make, cause the question, well, is this it? Is this, is this all? And that caused tensions in their relationship, because if this is just it, then why are we doing what we're doing? So all of it, right? So good men, good family, that for the first time, because of this sequestering in space and all these distractions are gone, now I just left to deal with life and legacy, threat, right? It is a gift. I experience it as a gift to be a part of that man's process, to help him through that particular season, right? And I'm just saying the fact that we have it and some other folks don't have it. That's precisely what we're here for, is to really be of support. Because again, some of the issues, and I can talk about AMI, which we call any mental illness versus serious mental illness. Serious mental illness is and there's treatment, strategies that go based upon the sort of diagnosis. But going through a depression period, right? That's just dealing with life. That's just being human, right? Right. And sometimes the expectation for our people and for men and boys sometimes is not to be human. Right? It's not to, human. It's not to go through stuff.
Wow. Yep. So we had a lot to deal with there, right? So here's the deal. You have shared that, obviously your resource, and I know, and I'm looking at the chat, and there's a couple of questions. So as we do wrap up, I want to drop a couple of these questions, see if you can answer them. One of them is has there been, based off what you said about going to West Africa, has there been any thought given to taking Black men to Africa as a part of treatment? As a part of treatment, yeah.
I'm sure it's interesting. So I'm sure that brighter minds than me have. I can actually say I'm not aware of it. But yeah, it would be interesting to think about, and I want to sort of think about it more specifically. But for example, Ghana had last year, probably everybody knew it was the year before, the year of return, right?
Yep, right. That
was a part of a whole movement to say, look, you have a home. And folks who feel like, their home is not here, right? That can actually play all types of therapeutic sort of roles, not just product role. So the answer to that person's question is, I don't know. I think it's a wonderful area of exploration, and it makes a lot of sense on some basic sort of mental health levels, for sure.
All right, good stuff. There's another one that says, as a Black woman, how do we have the conversation with our male family members and significant others? And it seems like they want to say who need to, or we want to get your services. Like, so it sounds like, how do we even have that conversation? Because, anytime you talk about getting help, people, put up the bars around them. Don't talk to me about help. I don't need no help.
I appreciate that. So it's an excellent question. My assumption is that, by the time that question is at that level, sort of based upon like a sense of urgency or need. What I would say is just two things. One, there really is an opportunity to have, and I'm excited about, doing things, and we do things, we have these sort of events to talk about how you can do things before you get to that point. So the types of conversations, the top 2 or 3 sort of things that one can have, before things become acute. But when things do get acute, right? And I appreciate the question. Part of it is, and I'll be honest, is for Black women and women in general have often loved men and boys more than we've loved ourselves. One of the things, and one of the things I would say is, for women, part of what I would say is that part of protecting yourself is to let folks know what your limits are. It has been the case in my experience that men, in general, right, we see the light or we feel the heat. And so sisters telling brothers, look, if you don't change or if you don't get help, then, I might not be there for you. They at some point kind of tend to hear that, right? And while that might not feel right, as it might feel as a sort of threat, I just want to offer that to sisters, because on one level, that's you protecting you. That's you not having to accept the burden of always doing and, all that sort of stuff. So telling someone that you have some boundaries and some needs, and that part of your need now for them to get some help, and that there's some consequences for that, I'm saying you should feel right in doing so. That's the first, right? Especially when it comes out of the sense. And the other is just the flip side is what I just said. It comes out of love. That, I've had, and trust me, it's not unusual for a good portion of the population to come because, the women in their lives and say, look, you have to. But that is also out of love too. Is to say that I know that we can be better. There's a different level there's levels to this, right? And where we at right now, whether it's where we're stuck or we're dealing with some of these, and we haven't talked issues of infidelity, our communication issues, our sexual lives are not what we want it to be. But I feel comfortable now having you seek our direction, mainly because maybe I see a brother who, shares, our sort of worldview and has the skill to be able to deal with it. So that's the other sort of thing I would, it becomes difficult to say all the time that people should get help or they should go get services when they don't feel confident in the people who are out there providing services.
That's right. Yeah, it's a big issue.
It is, right? That, when you feel comfortable, and again, if not me, I'm more than happy to sort of, make sure that, other Black social service providers, there's some gifted Black clinicians, gifted Black psychiatrists in this area. So if not me, then others. So part of the thing would be to actually give them the confidence to say that, now that we have this need, I feel even comfortable that actually somebody can help. Because the last thing you want is to send somebody to a person who might make things worse, to be quite honest. And that's what's happened often in Black life. We get stigmatized because we don't want to be labeled with stuff, but then we go to people who don't know how to deal with our issues. And then they misdiagnose us, mislabel us, right? All that stuff. So I get it.
Me dropping gems. Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, there you go. He's dropping gems, y'all, and he's showing y'all. So here's the deal. We're in wrap up right now, and I'll tell you, an hour has gone by quick. The first thing I'm going to say is thank you. Right. The second thing I'm going to say is we have to have you back. And I think what we'll do the next time is maybe we'll put it out there for questions that our community has, right? Because clearly there's some things that we need to address and deal with. So this, and what I'm going to ask everybody who's watching right now, and I need you all to do one thing. I need you to hit the share button. I need you to share this, right, with our community, with your followers. We share all kind of other things all the time. This is a serious, important conversation. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to have people be a part of it the next time, some in advance and some during as well. But Brother Jewel, I appreciate you. Can you give us, how do people get in contact with you at Male Behavioral Health if they need your services, they have a family member, it may be themselves that want to connect with you, want to talk and see the relevance of having you. So how do they get in contact with you?
Okay. Before I do that, again, I just want to give you mad sort of props and thank you so much for all that you do and the platform that you provide, because this is really important. But people can, two sort of main ways, they can call us at 614-360-9702. That's 614-360-9702. Or you can always find us online at Male Behavioral Health. You can just sort of Google that, or mbhinc.com. That's mbhinc.com.
Awesome. And we'll be sure to drop that in the chat as well. So with that being said, thanks again. I appreciate you. For those that are watching now, thank you for joining us for our Wellness Wednesday. So this is ColumbusBlack.com's Wellness Wednesday Lunch and Learn. Now, it's been lunchtime. Some of y'all may have eaten. If you didn't, go get something to eat. But hopefully you learned something, because I know the brother was dropping some serious gems over the last hour. There you go, right? So with that being said, I want to thank everybody. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, right? This is being simulcast live right now on Facebook Live and on YouTube Live. So be sure to make sure you introduce it and share it with other people. And then visit our website, ColumbusBlack.com. You're going to be able to sign up for our email newsletter. That's how you stay tuned to everything that we have going on, is through our email blast and then obviously through social. So please spread the word, share it. And if you need to advertise or promote your business, that's my shameless plug. Make sure that you reach out to us at info@ColumbusBlack.com, and we can help get the word out through our website, through our email blast, text blast, and social as well. And with that being said, we appreciate you all. Thanks again, Joel. We'll be talking real soon, and we'll get you back on the calendar when it works. and we'll go from there. All right.
Thanks so much, brother.
All right. You have a great one. Take care, everybody. Remember the last thing I always say, in order to be more successful in your future, you need to understand a little bit more about your past. So I want to thank y'all for joining us, and hopefully you learned something and you just had a blast. And on that